So in Matthew's gospel text today, Jesus says that the hairs of your head are all counted. It occurs to me that counting hairs on some heads is maybe a less time-consuming job than counting hairs on other heads. Would certainly be the case where I'm concerned. But Jesus really, I don't think, was trying to be funny here. He was actually talking quite seriously, about the reality of those who choose to follow him, and that in doing so, they would likely be recipients of hostility and rejection, much as Jesus has been to this point in his ministry. In fact, some of the leaders of that society had chosen to brand Jesus as Beelzebul, another word for Satan. And he says, how much more will they malign those who work for me? Jesus then tells his followers that they should not fear. In fact, he tells them 3 times that they should not fear. They should not fear because God's purposes will one day be revealed. They should not fear because God has control of the future. They should not fear because God also has control of the present. Now, in reality, though, isn't not fearing really kind of more easily said than done? I mean, you'll recall FDR famously proclaimed, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Yeah, okay. But really, who among us can simply turn fear off when it has us in its grips? And it doesn't really seem necessarily to matter what it is we fear. It's more about how far we've fallen into the grips of fear. We could be fearing terrorism or illness or bad things happening to family members or financial ruin. We could even be, fearing stepping on that crack that will break your mother's back. Or perhaps in the case of our mission trippers just returned from this last week, you could fear actually encountering one of the Washington, D.C. rats that Mr. Burke cited. I understand it started out this big, and then later it was this big, and then later it was this big. I really don't care what the issue might be. When real fear grips you, it can be totally debilitating. There's just no doubt about it. In our gospel, Jesus comments about not fearing in the context of his, is proposed to them in the context of these disciples who are about to be sent out into the towns and villages of Galilee to preach the good word. And what Jesus provides them isn't exactly a motivational speech. He says, "See, I'm sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to the councils and flog you in their synagogues. You will be dragged before governors and kings because of me." We know enough about fear to imagine that they weren't just ready to jump up and go. Probably not. Especially after he went on to speak of some of the other threats and dangers that they would face. Arrests, floggings, hatred, betrayal, and other forms of persecution. But then he told his disciples not to fear any of these things. He said, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Now, those words state an entirely different kind of perspective on fear from the one that usually haunts us. Jesus isn't saying that all we have to fear is fear itself, but rather he's saying that we need to fear that which is truly deadly to us. He's talking about things that truly matter. He's talking about things of importance. He's talking about the need for each of us to take the long view. The worst that other people or troublesome circumstances can do to us is still not as bad as suffering spiritual death. Physical death, perhaps, but spiritual death is nothing any of us can abide by. God and not anyone else. God holds our ultimate destiny. He holds that ultimate destiny in his hands. And in the final analysis, only two events can befall his followers: life and death. And both are in the hands of God. Okay, we can understand Jesus' point here, but it's still a bit of a stretch for us because we tend not to be people who live in the long view. We tend to be people who live day by day. And from that vantage point, truly there is a lot of scary stuff in this scripture. When confronted by a threat, who among us can sit back and say, oh well, whatever harm this situation may cause, it cannot destroy my soul? Probably not few of us. Not but a few of us. No, we see the threat to our immediate circumstances, and our fear is present, and it's in the present tense. And it's not unreasonable at all in many situations for us to express fear. In fact, most of us have a fear of something. It's just unavoidable. It's an involuntary response to a threat. It can be a positive thing in the case of an immediate threat, perhaps a threat to life or limb. It often leads us to respond in that fight or flight mechanism. And the appropriate reaction may be the one that actually saves our life. There have been studies done that report that realistic fear appears to be healthy for a person. Realistic fear. Moderate levels of fear, for example, have been associated with better adjustment to surgery than low or high levels of fear. But fear can also paralyze us and cause us to panic and react in ways that make things worse, or will prevent us from thinking straight. Comedian Jerry Seinfeld refers to the irrational way that we address our phobias like this. Seinfeld said, according to most studies, people's number one fear is public speaking. Number two is death. Death is number two. Does that sound right? This means to the average person, if you go to a funeral, you're better off to be in the casket than to be doing the eulogy. Jesus' instructions to his disciples invite us to let a little bit of heavenly light shine into that dark place, into those earthbound fears. That'll not cause us to put all our circumstantially driven fears behind us, certainly, but it can lower the level of terror inherent in situations that frighten us. And we should distinguish between being afraid and being fearful at this point. We have really little control over feelings. They simply are what they are for each of us. But we do have choices about our attitudes and how we will live. Feeling afraid is a normal response to a perceived threat. But being fearful is an attitude that we have about life in general. When it comes to fear, there's always some choice in how we choose to react. In the gospel reading, Jesus requires his followers to face their fear, even at its possible worst, and proceed in the right direction anyway. That has applications for us, even in the face of some of the problems that we each face in our day-to-day lives. We who follow Jesus really ought to remind ourselves that the things we fear are never the final word in our lives. That's what Jesus is trying to tell the disciples when he sent them out on this dangerous mission to preach the good news. I mean, we can imagine them, I think, saying a prayer as they walk down the road, "Dear God, don't let me panic." And it must have been answered, because they all went forward. Jesus assured them that God, whose eye was even on the sparrow, who even knew the number of hairs on their heads, would not desert them. And the same is true for all of us who walk with Jesus today. Nothing can separate us, nothing can separate you from the love of God. Not even fear itself, and not even the frightening things that actually do happen to us each and every day. And you'll have to pardon me, but I have to do this. There's just no combing over that fact. Blessings.